Believe it or not, Nosferatu never started out as a beloved film. Apart from exciting French surrealists in Paris, who immediately adopted Count Orlok as a figure of their own, other audiences looked sideways at this niche film. It was reviewed poorly in Germany, put audiences to sleep in New York, and London's Film Society back then dubbed it ridiculous and horrid. The successful audience it did find was minuscule, and the lack of commercial success drove the production company Prana Film, which only formed a year prior, into bankruptcy just 2 weeks after Nosferatu's debut. In addition, once Bram Stoker's widow, Florence Stoker, caught wind of the unauthorized adaptation of her late husband's novel Dracula, a lawsuit was swiftly filed and won, resulting in the elimination of all existing prints and negatives. With such a disaster in its wake, Murnau's gothic vampire tale disappeared into obscurity. That is, until German writer and film critic Siegfried Krauser made reference to Count Orlok in his 1947 novel, From Caligari to Hitler, a psychological history of the German film, and later in Lottie Eisner's 1952 book, The Haunted Screen, Expressionism in the German Cinema and the Influence of Max Reinhardt. Her book explored Weimar cinema, a period following World War I that was born out of the political and social instability under the Weimar Republic from 1918 to 1933. Weimar cinema sought to explore deeper, darker ideas compared to their American counterpart, and with financial limitations, on budgets that eventually gave birth to several techniques still seen in horror today. Eisner's book thrust Murnau's lost masterpiece back into the limelight, and ever since, its influence has spread. Well over a century after its initial release, Nosferatu, A Symphony of Horror continues to mystify, terrify, and entrance audiences across the world. And with the release of Robert Eggers' adaptation in sight, I felt that now would be the best time to not only explore the film that helped birth horror, but a movie that has stood as my favorite since I first saw it 18 years ago. Friedrich Wilhelm Plump was born in December 1888 in Bielefeld, Germany, and was the second of 3 sons from his father's second marriage. Plump was later replaced with Murnau as a stage name. His childhood was largely uneventful, with young Murnau having a strong interest in literature that his father quickly interpreted as problematic, and pushed his then preteen son into embracing more outdoor activities. The plan worked in part as this outdoor time produced a deep appreciation of nature that can be seen throughout all of Murnau's directorial features. Despite his father's disapproval, his love for literature continued to thrive as he grew older, moving to Berlin in 1907 to continue his studies in Romantic German literature, Shakespeare, German art history, and even going as far as to develop a foundation in Old English. Here he met his first lover, Hans. Yes, you heard me right, and it totally caught me off guard too. Murnau's romance with Hans has been noted as an important one by many that have studied his life, as Hans's family also took in Murnau as their own, a connection that Murnau personally appreciated, given the tensions between him and his biological father. Unfortunately, Murnau's education was cut short, both by his father refusing tuition and by the distinct call of a world war. In October 1914, Murnau was recruited by the 1st Regiment of Foot Soldiers and stationed in Potsdam, a small city a few hours south of Berlin. Hans, who had followed Murnau into war, tragically passed away in 1915, and without this relationship, military life became unbearable for Murnau. Thus, in 1917, he applied and was quickly accepted as an observer in Verdun, France, where he went on to become a fighter pilot, a successful one at that. In December 1917, while flying over Switzerland, his plane got lost in a fog, and it's here that he spent the remainder of World War I as a POW. Upon his release in 1919, Murnau moved back to Berlin and set up his first independent film company. Prana Film was a short-lived silent-era German film studio founded in 1921 by Enrico Deichmann and occultist artist Albin Grau, soon to be the producer and production designer for Nosferatu. Grau enlisted Murnau as the director soon after meeting, and by this time Murnau had almost a dozen films under his belt. Grau is perhaps as equally influential on the final vision of Nosferatu, as it's his storyboarding and imagery that laid down the foundation for Murnau's magic. Henrik Galeen was enlisted to write the script, though it was heavily altered later by Murnau, eliminating much of Galeen's German Expressionism in favor of overt romanticism, though still keeping all the changes that distinguish Nosferatu from Dracula. Set in 1838 in the fictional German town of Wisborg, Thomas Hutter is sent by his employer, estate agent Herr Nock, to visit a new client, Count Orlok, who is planning on buying a house in the town across from Hutter's own residence. Despite the desperate pleas of his young wife Ellen, Hutter embarks on a lengthy voyage to Orlok's remote castle in Transylvania, where despite his good nature, is greeted with many ominous signs of the Count's evil nature. As Hutter arrives at the castle and meets the Count, he finds that things are not as they seem as he realizes his generous host is a vampire. What ensues is a tale of the power of evil, as Hutter tries desperately to return home in order to protect Ellen and the inhabitants of Wisborg, who unfortunately fall victim to Orlok's reign of death. Murnau's early life alongside the political atmosphere of 19th and early 20th century Germany were of great influence on not just his first production, 1919's The Boy in Blue, but came to shape many of the themes that his magnus opus explores. Fear of the unknown and the foreign, plague and disease, greed and ambition, sexuality and repression, isolation and loneliness, and of course, good versus evil. Murnau's application of these themes are strongly established through scenery and shot composition in Nosferatu. The first shot of the film, following the opening text cards, is of St. Mary's Church Tower in Wismar, Germany, the secondary setting for the film and one that encompasses all that is inherently good. The church tower not only represents those forces of good, but foreshadows the incoming disarray and peril our main characters end up experiencing. Additional exterior shots were filmed in Lübeck, particularly Hutter's short exchange with the elderly gentleman, the Hutter House, and most importantly, the former salt lodge that would serve as Orlok's new Wisborg home. The Hutter House in particular emphasizes the innocence of our young couple, surrounded by florals and standing as a shining example of 19th century German architecture. As the film progresses, Murnau doesn't shy away from using natural environments to convey the emotions of his script. Long exterior shots of the Transylvanian village outside Orlok's castle, the ominous landscapes surrounding the castle, and the innocence of the Hutter residence and Wisborg establish emotions of fear, anxiety, and foreboding that can be felt by any audience in the world. Even more captivating is Murnau's clearly artistic expression through these shots, which emphasize a certain amount of romanticism inspired by notable paintings, as opposed to the strict expressionism the film is often associated with. Scenery and landscapes are not all Murnau can be praised for, as Nosferatu uses animals upwards of 15 times to convey evil. Outside of Wisborg, animals typically associated with the horror genre are used not just to explore malevolence, but allow the audience to bear witness to Orlok's influence over the world around him. The people of the Carpathian Inn are frightened by a werewolf, later shown to be a gangly hyena. Wolf packs roam the spaces around Orlok's castle. A spider weaving a web around its prey foreshadows Orlok's hold on Hutter, Ellen, and Nock. The plague rats that emphasize the death the great Count brings wherever he ventures, and even purposeful shots of horses allude to biblical imagery of chariots and apocalyptic horsemen. While many of his scenery and animal shots evoke storytelling, others serve merely as symbolism. The scientist who gives a lecture on the Venus flytrap, the vampire of the plant kingdom, then Knock in a jail cell catching flies, snatching them greedily as vampires do blood, almost begging the audience to answer the question, why cannot man likewise be a vampire? When Knock senses his master has arrived, he escapes as we witness Orlok dash through Wisborg with a coffin on his back. As fear of the plague spreads and the town begins looking for a scapegoat, Knock is stoned amidst the cramped streets of newly filled coffins, each sequence intercut with the scurrying of rats. Ellen Hutter learns that the only way to stop a vampire is for a good woman to distract him, so that he stays out past the first rooster's crow. Her sacrifice not only saves the city, but also reminds us of the buried sexuality in Bram Stoker's Dracula, which was written with 19th century Victorian values, inspiring no end of analysis from readers who wonder if the buried message of Dracula might be that unfiltered sex is dangerous to society. It's here that one of Nosferatu's most subliminal themes of sexuality and repression can be interpreted. Murnau, a homosexual during a shift in Germany where homosexuality was once again condemnable, combines this with Stoker's narrative of sexual repression, which can be seen most obviously in the Hutters' marriage. Their love, though obvious, is hollow and superficial, which is later confirmed by the fact that Ellen is still a virgin. Ellen's sexuality blooms in Hutter's absence, roaming the Harding household in her nightgown, and later using herself to seduce the Count. While questionable, Orlok doesn't succumb to a stake as most vampire mythos of the time suggest, but instead the unwavering good of a traditional marriage and values, implying that vampirism could be a metaphor for a societal deconstruction of values that can only be cured through nuclear families and bourgeoisie values. The substance of the film aside, perhaps most notable is Max Schreck's portrayal of Count Orlok, who is a stark contrast to the romanticized Count Dracula that to this day oozes an appeal that jump-started the vampire craze that eventually led us to the likes of Twilight.
This is the skin of a killer, Bill.
Orlok is a true face of horror, and one that audiences had not yet been exposed to at the time. His presence is uncanny and uncomfortable, creeping in from the shadows in his most iconic moments, and hanging within the background of other scenes like a foul, imposing stench. His pointed ears, sharp nose, bushy eyebrows, and almost alien scalp, paired with his lanky limbs and looming posture, paint a portrait of true horror that bridges the gap between the natural horror of the period into something that is all too relatable in human form. Murnau's vampire film was also a technical trendsetter. The German Expressionist style heavily declined with the rise of the Nazis in the 1930s, who viewed the art form as degenerate because of its deviation from realism and often critical portrayal of society. Thus, many artists emigrated, taking the style with them, influencing the spread of Expressionism globally, eventually inspiring much of Hollywood's film noir period. This additional creative emigration out of Germany essentially laid down the foundation for horror, providing the somewhat niche genre a new visual vocabulary to explore the macabre and the psychological. Distorted sets, exaggerated makeup, and stylized lighting were now emphasized to convey psychological states. Sets began to be painted or constructed in such ways that didn't mimic reality, but instead reflected the internal condition of the characters or the film's narrative. Dramatic lighting, the play of light and shadow, were further used to create eerie atmospheres, as well as the concept of a vampire as a figure of terror rather than seduction. The unsettling depiction of Count Orlok with his elongated fingers and rat-like features became iconic, pushing these looks to become staples in horror as well. Murnau employed other innovative techniques like double exposures, forced perspectives, and and rapid montage to create supernatural effects. By all accounts, Nosferatu's visual storytelling was well ahead of its time, using these methods and more to suggest the presence of evil in ways that were both subtle and striking. And of course, most famously of all, Nosferatu introduced the idea that sunlight could be fatal to vampires, where all prior mythos had previously alluded to them being virtually indestructible. As horror and the vampire subgenres grew into their own respective monsters, Murnau's influence is palpable. 1931's Dracula, starring Bela Lugosi, utilizes Murnau's lighting and once again makes its vampire lead menacing. Werner Herzog's 1979 adaptation, Nosferatu the Vampire, pays direct homage to Murnau's original vision, while adding his own unique touches to Klaus Kinski's portrayal of the titular count. 2008's Let the Right One In, a Swedish vampire film, continues to use lighting to play on emotions, while turning the vampire back into a creature of loneliness and isolation, much like Orlok. Outside of the vampire subgenre, films like 2014's The Babadook employ a similar approach to horror with its use of shadow and minimalistic storytelling, echoing the eerie atmospheres of Nosferatu, and owing much of its visual style and psychological horror elements to German Expressionism. By the end of World War II, Florence Stoker's lawsuit did little to stop Nosferatu from regaining influence, as despite the overwhelming inspiration from her husband's novel, the film managed to survive illegally, with prints eventually being restored and later redistributed throughout the West by the 1980s. Regardless, her case highlighted early legal issues in film regarding intellectual property, influencing how adaptations are approached today, and eventually pushing Nosferatu into the public domain in 2019. Following the bankruptcy of Prana Film, Murnau went on to become one of Germany's most acclaimed directors, later moving to Hollywood and building a reputation as the German genius, and even signing on to multi-year deals with studios like Fox. Though much was lost to time, the versions of Nosferatu that circulate today are more or less faithful to everything Murnau and Prana Film had set out to do. Nosferatu, a symphony of horror, redefined horror in the old world and birthed the horror genre into a new world it single-handedly created. Technical and stylistic influences aside, Count Orlok continues to stand as the grandfather of cinematic vampires, reminding us that though this creature can be sensual and alluring, it is equal parts monstrous and terrifying. As always, thanks for stopping by and stay frosty, friends.